as you're filling out the survey, let me give a quick introduction to our speaker today, Lucy. And I think you'll tell us a little bit more about your background, Lucy, later during your presentation. But for those of you who are listening who aren't familiar with Lucy Saunders, she's a public health specialist, an urbanist, a transport planner, the creator and director of Healthy Streets approach that she'll be telling you about today. She's an advisor to the WHO and the UK government's Departments of Transport and Health, and has shared her expertise with many other cities and regions around the world. So we're very happy to have you joining us today, Lucy.
Thank you.
And we'd also like to welcome all of you in the audience who are listening in today. We've taken a little bit of a look at who is joining us, and we're very happy to see so many people participating from so many different places. We have representatives from several different countries, including Sweden, Finland, Estonia, and Latvia, which are the countries that the HEAT project partners come from, and from several different sectors. We have NGOs, the public sector, private sectors, and probably a few interested citizens joining us as well, which we think is great to see.
I'm a little bit unusual in my professional background. I trained as a public health specialist and worked in all different areas of public health over many years. And then I decided to specialise in the field of transport and built environment. And you'll see why from this presentation. I developed the Healthy Streets approach, and then I worked in London to implement that approach through the government system in London over 7 years. And as Amelia was saying, I now work with other cities and regions, and I still do work in London as well, to take the Healthy Streets approach forward and apply it in different places. So why do we need healthy streets? Well, there are 5 big health impacts of urban transport. These are physical activity, road traffic injuries, poor air quality, noise pollution, and severance. So if we take these each in turn, physical activity is really important. It's one of the big health issues. If we're physically active every day, then it reduces our risk of 25 different chronic health conditions, including depression, type 2 diabetes, and various cancers. Adults need a minimum of 150 minutes of activity a week. So that's approximately 20 minutes of walking or cycling a day. That's not very much exercise, but only around 6 in 10 adults are meeting this minimum level in European countries. So we need to be doing really much more than this, and yet many of us aren't even achieving this bottom level of activity. Road traffic injuries have widespread impact. So traffic crashes cause about 127,000 deaths and 2.4 million injuries a year in the European region. And traffic crashes kill more children and young people aged 5 to 29 than any other cause. But maybe one of the biggest impacts of traffic crashes is the impacts on the family and friends of the people who are injured and who are killed in road traffic crashes, and the effect it has in deterring people from walking and cycling as part of their daily routine. Air quality, poor air quality, affects cardiovascular and respiratory health, child development, and life expectancy, amongst many other impacts. 40 million people in the EU are exposed to harmful levels of pollution, and every year we're learning more about the negative impacts of air quality, poor air quality on our health. Noise affects our sleep, our stress levels, our cardiovascular health. It affects adults performing well at work and children learning and child development. And 65% of the European population is exposed to harmful noise levels from transport. So it's a really widespread problem. And severance may be a term you've never heard of before. It's not a commonly used word. It's a word to describe it being difficult to get from where you are to where you want to be. Severance is commonly caused by big roads, by railway lines, by rivers, by tunnels. It disproportionately affects people on low incomes who have fewer options about where they live, where they're going to, and how they get there. It has a wide range of impacts on our health. It affects our ability to connect with other people, It affects our ability to access health services, healthy food, good jobs and education. And severance isn't always about big, busy roads like this one in the picture here. If someone has an icy footpath in front of their home and the ice stays on that footpath, if they're old and frail and they're concerned that if they step on the icy footpath, they will slip and fall and break their hip, then they're experiencing severance because their choices about where they go and what they do are being impacted by that street environment. So severance can be permanent and it can be big, or it can be temporary and it can be very small. So, oh, sorry. I wanted to show you the top causes of illness and early death in Finland. It's a bit of a gloomy graph for us to be looking at, and just to show you how gloomy it is, I deliberately made it grey, and normally my pictures are very colourful. And I could show you this graph for any of your countries that you're here from today, but I chose Finland. And this shows you from all the things that cause people to get sick and to die young, these are the top causes. And this graph is actually very similar for countries across Europe and North America, Australia, and many other developed countries. We have very similar graphs. The bars maybe swap around a little bit, but it's always the same things at the top causes of illness and early death. And the top causes are summarized in the public health community as the big four. The big four are exercise, diet, smoking, and alcohol. Now, the reason why exercise and diet are slightly bigger here than smoking and alcohol is because every one of us needs to take exercise every day, and every one of us needs to eat healthy food for all of our meals. But smoking and alcohol are things that some people choose to participate in consuming. So not everyone is directly impacted by smoking and alcohol. And the reason why these big four are the same around the whole world is because the things that affect how healthy we are largely determined today in high-income countries by how people live their everyday lives. And around the world, even though we have many cultural differences and language differences between countries, the way we live our everyday lives is broadly very similar. Around the world, we're eating a similar diet, which tends to be higher energy than we need it to be. We are moving more towards jobs that involve us sitting, looking at a screen, so spending most of our day sitting, and people are moving away from jobs that involve a lot of activity. And in our free time, we are all moving towards spending the majority of our free time sitting, watching a screen. It could be a computer screen or a phone or a television, but we're spending more and more of our free time sitting. And these trends in all these different countries are affecting the health of the populations. And then we look at how we travel. And again, there's been a change in how people travel over the last 50, 70 years. So the majority of people are moving to what we call sedentary ways of traveling, car-based travel. So these are the top causes of illness and early death from all different sources. And earlier we were talking about the top health impacts of transport and streets. So how important is transport and streets and built environment to these grey bars in this graph? How much of an impact can we in our daily jobs have on this graph? How much impact can we have? Well, before the session started, we gave you a Mentimeter question asking you, which is the biggest health impact of urban transport? And we gave you 5 options: physical activity, injuries, air quality, noise, and severance. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to vote for which of these you think is the biggest health impact, and hopefully we can now see the results. So we have a lot of people have voted for physical activity, and also a lot of people have voted for air quality. Shall we have a look and see? Well, when we look at this graph for Finland, we can see low physical activity is at number 13 of the top causes of illness and early death. But actually it also influences all these other bars that I've highlighted in green. So if we're physically active every day, we reduce our risk of high blood pressure, of type 2 diabetes, of year-on-year weight gain that can lead to obesity, high cholesterol. Occupational risks refers to predominantly in high-income countries, things like musculoskeletal issues, a bad back from sitting all day, and mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and stress from feeling that we don't have control over our jobs, over our lives. And low bone mineral density is when we have weak, frail bones, and that means that we're more at risk of being injured. And we can prevent that to an extent by being more physically active. So low physical activity has quite a big impact, even though it only shows up as one individual bar on this graph. If physical activity was a drug, it would be classed as a wonder drug. The importance of physical activity can really not be overemphasized. It helps every part of our body to work well, to function well. And if we're physically active, it helps to prevent a lot of very common illnesses. And it also helps to treat people and help them to recover more quickly when they are ill. So exercise was one of our big four that I showed you earlier on. It's really important, and it's the biggest health impact of transport and urban systems. But many people think how much exercise we do is determined by how much we as individuals are motivated to put on some lycra and to do something sporty like this guy in the picture here. In reality, when we look at populations around the world, the ones that have got the higher activity levels are not any different in terms of motivation levels than people from any other countries. The thing that determines how much exercise people do is not their motivation, but it's the environment that they live in. So the challenge we have is that we have inactive work environments, we have inactive leisure environments, and for many years we tried to encourage people, incentivize people to do activity in their leisure time, and we haven't been very successful there. And we also have inactive travel environments, and we have shown that we can help lots of people very cost effectively build a small amount of activity into their daily routine by changing their travel behavior to one that's active. So if we go back to our graph, we see that road traffic injuries does feature in this graph, but only in very small sections. So there's a little bit in alcohol use. So this is the road traffic injuries that are caused by people who are intoxicated, killing or injuring themselves or someone else. There's a little bit in occupational risks, which is where people who are driving for work kill or injure themselves or someone else. And there's a little bit in bone mineral density, where people who have low bone mineral density are involved in road traffic injuries. But air quality, noise, and severance don't feature in this top causes, and that's not because they're not important. Air quality for Finland is just slightly further down that graph, and if we look at other countries in the European region, it's often a bit higher. Noise and severance are currently not shown, and that's not because they're not important, it's because we're not very good at measuring their impacts yet. So as the data gets better over the coming years, we can expect to see them starting to appear in that graph too. So why do we need healthy streets? This was the question that I posed to you at the beginning. Well, the reason why we need healthy streets is because we have some really urgent health needs that we can only address through changing the way that our streets look and feel, so that people can build some everyday activity into their routine and get all those health benefits from being physically active, while also addressing those issues of severance, noise, road danger, and poor air quality. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Lucy, for this beginning part of your presentation. And again, I'd like to ask everybody if you have questions for Lucy to send them along in the chat. We'll have some time now and at the end before we wrap up. And I'd like to ask you now, obviously everybody is talking about and thinking about and considering Corona in their daily lives now around the globe, and talking about how the environment can impact our health. What impacts do you think, apart from the impacts from the actual disease, are having on health? What other secondary impacts do you think the Corona pandemic might be having on people's environment and secondarily then on their health?
Yeah, it's a really interesting area, and I think we won't know for some time what the long-term impacts are. So, and I think they vary from place to place. So some people who are fortunate enough to live in environments where they have interesting local environments and easy places to walk and to cycle may find that they're doing more walking and cycling and more local travel. So it might make it easier for people if they're working from home more to do short local trips rather than a long commute trip that might have been car based. But then there's lots of other people who live in poor environments, and we're not necessarily seeing an increase in them going out and walking and cycling as much because the environment doesn't support it. So we may actually see a reduction in physical activity amongst some people. So there is the risk of really increasing inequalities. But at this point, there's many different trends happening in different places. And it's really hard to tell overall what the long-term impact is going to be. I think there's an opportunity for all of us to try and shape it though. And we need to take this chance to try and make sure that we end up with a better environment than we started with.
Great, and hopefully maybe we can reconnect a little bit to that question after we learn a little bit more about the Healthy Streets approach and how we can really work to make the environment more conducive for more people to move in their daily lives. And I think it's really interesting to look at these big 5 health impacts. And this might be a little bit of a big question, but do you have any thoughts on, how did it get to be this way? How did it get to be that our cities have so many of these problems and that they're so prevalent in so many of our cities?
It is a big question, and I do quite a lengthy lecture when I talk through all of these issues. But in a nutshell, it's to do with our choice that we made in the middle of the last century to allow widespread car ownership and car use. And the countries that put more constraints on car use have got healthier environments, city environments, than the countries that didn't put constraints on car use. So you see different policies in different countries, but overall, the easier it is to drive and park, the worse the environment is for public health, and that's seen across the world.
And I think this concept of severance is really interesting and isn't talked about as often as many of the other health impacts are. Could you just talk a little bit more about severance and how that's maybe come about as some of these choices that have been made in the past, and what kind of norms or thoughts in our societies do you think could be contributing?
Yeah, I think when we used to build our cities many hundreds of years ago for people who were primarily walking around, we, by nature of what we were building and the tools we had available to us, built a network of streets that were very easy to make into healthy environments. And when our capabilities to build big engineering structures developed, it happened to happen at the same time as the proliferation of private car ownership. So then we started building very big roads that cut through these old neighborhoods that actually could have been quite healthy. And the interesting trend I see happening around the world now is cities and countries spending huge amounts of money trying to remove the severance they created in the 1960s and 1970s There's lots of experience I have of that in London, but I also see it in South Korea, and that makes me feel positive that people are trying to undo the negative impacts of severance. But at the same time, there are still many countries that are building new severance all the time. New roads, new roundabouts, the things that we know cause problems are still being built all around the world, all of the time.
Yeah, there's lots of changes happening in many societies, and we have a question from Andra in the audience here on a change that many cities has been experiencing recently on what's your opinion of electric bikes, scooters, etc. It's not a car, but it doesn't involve that much physical activity either.
Mm-hmm. I see it as a really positive move forward because while there may be less physical activity in using an electric scooter, actually electric bikes and electric scooters enable a lot of people who might previously have not felt they had the fitness level or the physical capability to use another mode to try not using a car. And a city in which people are inside metal boxes where they can't see each other and they can't hear each other, it's very difficult to build a society, to have community, to have human interaction, and to build trust. But when people are outside of those sealed metal boxes that are cars and they're interacting with each other, it's much easier to then have a conversation about fairness in the distribution of the street space. But these new technologies, they just draw more attention to the fact that the streets in our cities are providing too much space for private cars and not enough space for people walking and cycling and using e-scooters. And it just makes that problem even more urgent, that we need to reallocate the street space.
So even though they maybe aren't the most physically active form of transportation, you see it as kind of an entry step and a way to get people out of their cars and into the open, and in a way where you can maybe have eye-to-eye meetings with other people walking around or moving around in your city.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, we'll pause the questions for now, and we'll have a longer session for questions at the end of your presentations. So let's move along now and hear the next part.
Okay, so I've mentioned healthy streets, but right now we don't know what healthy streets is. So in this section, I'm going to be talking through what are the 10 healthy streets indicators, and to give you some examples of different places where these have been delivered in different ways. So healthy streets is quite simply just these 10 indicators. It's a framework that you can use to focus people's attention on what really matters, which is, what does it feel like to be on a street? If we change the way that it feels to be on a street, then we address our big public health issues that I mentioned in the last section, and we deliver a whole range of other benefits as well. So the first of the 10 healthy streets indicators is easy to cross. So easy to cross is referring to this issue of severance. And there's an important matter with the healthy streets indicators. To make it accessible to everyone, to engage the community, we don't use technical language like severance. We use plain language that everyone can understand. So instead of saying severance, we say easy to cross. And this example here, it might just look very boring to you, but it was a very important step forward in this location because lots of people wanted to walk along what we call the desire line, which is what this zebra crossing is set across. It's on a desire line, it's on a diagonal line. And there's a tendency to try and force people when they're walking and when they're cycling to take a route that will not inconvenience the cars. So often we provide walking and cycling that is inconvenient and people don't want to use the facilities that are provided, and they will just walk where they want to walk or they will cycle where they want to cycle. But when you design streets from the perspective of what people really want, you get a much better outcome. So in this location, for many years, there was no crossing because it wasn't a convenient place to put a crossing. But eventually, they've put this crossing in a place that is very well used by lots of people walking on a desire line. And this is another example of easy to cross, and this is a different kind of a street. And this isn't a formal crossing, but what they've done yet again is taken the principle of making it direct, instantaneous, and convenient when they're putting in the crossing. So this crossing place is right next to where the buses stop. So people don't have to cross the street a long way away and then walk down to where the buses are. They can see the bus stop and then go, right, I want to cross here. This might sound really simple to you, but go and look around your city and you will see how often we put our crossing places not where it's convenient for people who want to cross, and not instantaneous. We make people wait a long time to cross the street while we let the cars go through. And easy to cross is about thinking about the street from the perspective of the people who are walking and who are cycling, and making sure that they are prioritized, that they have the easiest possible way to get from one side of a street to another. The next indicator I want to talk about is shade and shelter. Now, this is another health impact that I didn't mention in the last section. So providing shade and shelter is important from a health perspective because we need shelter when it's heavy rain, heavy snow, so that people can still walk and cycle even when the weather is not great. And we need shade from the increasing hot summers that we have and the risk that people with fair skin in particular have of skin cancer. So from a health perspective, we need these things. There are also certain people who really struggle to moderate their body temperature. So when it's very hot, older people, young babies, and people who are undergoing chemotherapy sometimes can't go out in the street and walk and cycle because they are at greater risk because they can't keep their temperature down. So we have to look at how we reduce the urban heat island effect. How do we keep the streets cooler? And that's where shade and shelter can really help as well. This example here is a nice street for showing shade and shelter because it highlights that delivering healthy streets is not just about what the local authority does. It's not just about what government does in the street, but it's also about what private businesses do and what architects do. So you can see there are some fixed awnings on one side of the street that were introduced by the business. And then on the other side of the street, the design of the building provides some shelter, in addition to the trees that are provided in the street. So healthy streets is not just the job of government, it's actually the job of all the stakeholders in the street environment. And here's another quite different example of shade and shelter. So this is a very tall skyscraper building in a city centre. And this shade and shelter is there to provide some shelter from the rain, but also to mitigate the impact of high winds that occur when you have very tall buildings. So they're not just thinking about the human experience in terms of bright sunlight and rain and snow, but also high winds and how high wind will impact whether people are choosing to walk and cycle. And they've tried to be thoughtful in making sure that their feature that they've added is something to see, something that makes the street more interesting to look at. And we'll come back to that later on. Our third indicator is places to stop and rest. Now, often people think places to stop and rest is about benches, and it absolutely is. So we need to provide places for people to sit down at regular intervals along every street. And that is not just because some older people struggle to walk longer distances, people who have mobility impairment struggle to walk long distances without a rest. It's actually because we all benefit. We all have moments in our day when we are carrying heavy shopping, we're traveling with children, we need to tie up our shoe, we need to check our phone, we need to put our coat on, we want to stop and talk to a friend, we want to sit and watch the world go by. So we really don't provide enough places for people to sit down. We tend to provide them on shopping streets, and that we forget that people actually need to walk to the shopping street and they need regular places to stop on the way to the street where they're going to do the shopping too. But places to stop and rest is not just about benches. It's about providing enough space that when people are walking or cycling, they can move out of the flow of other people walking and cycling and take a break. So have a look in your own cities at the cycle infrastructure that you build. Generally, when we build cycle infrastructure, we assume the people cycling are on their own, they're traveling in single file, and they're never stopping, apart from at traffic lights. And so they have to go, 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 go. And if something happens, like they get a message from their friend on the phone, or they see someone they want to stop and talk to, if they stop, then everyone behind them has to stop as well. So places to stop and rest is about making sure we have nice wide pavements and nice wide cycle facilities. And examples like this one here, where you can cycle easily out of the flow of other people cycling, to stop and lock up your bike without having to get off it and climb up some steps or go up onto a pavement to do it. So it's about cycle storage on street just as much as it is about seating, and it's also about nice wide cycle tracks and nice wide pavements. Not too noisy is our next indicator, and we've talked already about the health impacts of noise. But beyond the health impact, there's other reasons why we don't want our streets to be too noisy. When it's noisy, people can't talk to each other. So being on the street is not a pleasant experience. People can't interact socially. And if your choice is, I can walk along the street in silence with my friends, or we can go in a car and we can have a conversation, the preference will be for the more sociable option. So having streets that are too noisy takes out the sociable option in walking and cycling. This example here is a shopping street that was temporarily closed so that people could experience what it's like to be on that street when it's not filled with cars. And they use the street very differently. They have a much more enjoyable experience of being on the street. And these temporary events are an important part of delivering healthy streets, because it's quite a non-confrontational way of showing people that things could be different. It's a way of us saying, you have options on how this street is used. It doesn't have a fixed use. And if you like, sometimes it can be like this, or it can permanently be like this. It's your choice. So temporary events can be very helpful in helping to bring the general public into a conversation about what they want their streets to be like. And here's another picture for not too noisy. And you might think, why on earth is there a picture of on-street cycle storage for not too noisy? Well, this is a bike hanger that is put in the place of an on-street parking space, so that people who don't have space in their homes to store a bicycle can store it out on the street instead. And by removing an on-street parking space, it reduces the number of cars that are circulating on the street. So that will help to reduce the noise levels, because people cycling is a lot quieter than people using cars. It also means that that curbside space, you don't have cars sitting with their engines running, which is quite noisy for the people inside the homes, because now there is something that's quiet in their place. People choose to walk and cycle. This is obviously really at the heart of healthy streets. We want to create environments in which people feel that the preferable way to travel short journeys is on foot or by cycle. And this example here is from the outer suburbs of London. And this was a neighbourhood which was very car dependent, and there wasn't a huge appetite for cycling. To make it more appealing to the residents, to get them to buy into the changes that they wanted to deliver, what they did was they chose a design that didn't look too much like traditional traffic engineering cycle infrastructure. It's not painted red or green or blue. It doesn't have a lot of signage on it. It's just a sandy coloured surface. So if you don't really like cycling and you're not interested in cycling and you don't think it's going to enhance your local area, you just have a nicer street environment. They introduced all this planting that you can see on the left-hand side as well, to make it feel like a much more pleasant place for local residents. So healthy streets is partly about taking a more human-centered focus on design than traffic-focused. So sometimes you will see a project that has technically provided some space for cycling and some space for walking, but it doesn't look beautiful. It doesn't bring joy to the people who are walking and cycling. Yes, they technically have some space, but it's not a positive enhancement of the environment for everyone. I really feel we need to move away from that traffic engineering-led approach to street design and think more about the aesthetics of it. Now, here's another example for people choose to walk and cycle. The key word in people choose to walk and cycle is the word choose. So there are many people in the world who are walking and cycling, not because they choose to, but because they have to. And what we want to do is change that balance of choice. So it's slightly more appealing to walk or cycle a short journey than it is to drive that journey. We want to make it slightly less convenient to drive and less enjoyable and rewarding to drive, at the same time as making it slightly more enjoyable and more rewarding to walk or to cycle. Places that have really struggled to increase walking and cycling are the places that have not tried to make car use less rewarding or less convenient. If you just try to make walking and cycling more appealing and you don't make it less appealing to drive, you really struggle to get the majority of people to leave their cars. Cars are very comfortable, warm, safe, relaxing environment. So people will choose that if that's still an easy option. So this example here, this is actually related to the response to COVID in London. So there's been a widespread rollout of a program called School Streets, where the street around a school is temporarily closed for the time in the morning when the children are being dropped off and the time in the evening when they're being picked up from school. And what this does, it creates a nice space in the street where people can socially distance when they're approaching the school, which is good. It also makes driving children to school slightly less convenient. There's what we call a hassle factor that wasn't there before. So in the past, people could have driven straight to the front door of the school, opened the car, throw the children out, drive off. Very easy. Now they have this additional hassle. They have to find somewhere to go and park and then walk the last section of the journey with the children. And that is enough often for people to switch a short car journey to one that they walk or cycle. And the children have got a nice low traffic street to go along, so it's more enjoyable for them. Next, we have people feel safe. Now, we've talked about road traffic injuries, but people feel safe is also referring to social safety. So safety from fear of being attacked, abused, being a victim of some kind of crime. And this example here is a neighbourhood street where they've tried through the architecture to address some of those social safety factors. So you can see it's a low traffic street, it's quite quiet and nice, it's got tight junctions on the side streets, and all these things help to make it feel safer for a family cycling. But the new buildings that have been built, which you can see in the background, they have doors and windows that open out onto the street and balconies. So these active frontages mean that these streets feel very much alive, even at night. And they have good street lighting, so they feel safer in the dark. And that means that people can choose to walk and cycle even when it's later in the day or in places where they might otherwise not feel safe. So this again is an example of how land use planning and architecture is really important for helping to deliver healthy streets. And here's another example for people feel safe. So this is a street where there was a real issue with people driving too fast. As you can imagine, a long straight road where you can see a long way into the distance really encourages you to drive fast. But what they wanted to do was make it clear to people driving that this is a space where there are lots of people walking and cycling. It's actually just in front of a school. So they created a curve in the street so that the cars have to slow down to go around the curve. They raised the level of the carriageway up to the level of the pavement, so it's all one even surface, which tells the people driving someone could just step out at any second without any warning, so I need to go slowly. And they use this coloured paint and the seating and the planting to all act as means of slowing people down when they're driving. And this is a programme that we really need across many streets to change the design of the street so that people driving understand how slowly they really need to be going if they're going to be driving at a safe speed in a place where people are walking and cycling. Things to see and do. We mentioned this a little bit earlier under shade and shelter. Things to see and do is really important because if we don't make our streets interesting and engaging, then people won't choose to walk and cycle. We know that journeys feel longer and more boring if there's not something interesting to see along the way, if things don't change, if there aren't other people around, if we can't see the changing nature, the changing plants, the changing seasons, changing displays in shop windows. So things to see and do is really a vital part of us making streets places where people go out and socialise and walk and cycle. And this is one example where our efforts to provide something to see and do are combined with our efforts to adapt to climate change. So this planting in this picture here, very beautiful planting, but it also provides sustainable urban drainage. So when there is a flash flood, because we get sudden downpours of rain, the rain flows off the carriageway, and instead of going straight into the drains and putting pressure on the drainage system, they filter down through these plants that take the toxins out of the water, and then clean water enters the drainage system. So it's a double benefit. And healthy streets, obviously the ultimate public health challenge we have is climate change. So we have to take opportunities to try and adapt to climate change and mitigate it wherever we can. Here's another example from things to see and do. And this is about the community taking part. So delivering healthy streets is not just about businesses and architects and government, it's also about what people themselves do. And here some residents didn't have some space to play table tennis in their own house. Many people don't have gardens, so they just put the table tennis into the street. And now there's something social happening in the street. It reminds people that streets are not just for cars and for parking private cars. It makes something interesting for other people who are walking and cycling past too. People feel relaxed is our next indicator. And people feel relaxed is actually capturing a lot of the ambience of a street environment. So do we have a nice wide pavement? Do we have a nice clean surface? Do we have a nice smooth cycle track to travel on? All these things affect how relaxed we feel, how much we feel we can switch off. And this is an example of a little bit of leftover space in the street where they chose to put in what is called a pocket park. And having people sitting around reading and chatting changes the atmosphere on what is a busy street to be one that feels much more relaxing for other people. And here's another example of people feel relaxed, which is where the pavement carries on continuously across the side street, so that when you're walking along the street, you don't have to stop at every side street and look for cars and then continue. The people who are driving the cars, they have to stop and wait while people walk across. So it makes the walking experience a lot more relaxing for people because they don't have to look out for danger at every junction. The responsibility lies with the people who pose the danger, the people who are driving the cars. Clean air, we've talked about the health impacts of clean air. We don't need to dwell on it. This is one example of a street that was transformed to try and make it a much lovelier place to be. And adding this level of planting will definitely be helping to an extent with improving air quality. But actually the things that have a really big impact on air quality are much bigger citywide policies. And healthy streets is not just about making changes on individual little streets, it's about big policy changes. And this sign here, ultra low emission zone, indicates that the centre of London, you now have to pay an additional charge if you want to drive into it in a polluting vehicle. And what this does is it really pushes lots of people to switch to cleaner vehicles because they don't want to pay the charge. And that helps to deliver real widespread air quality improvements very quickly. And finally, our last indicator is everyone feels welcome. This is our ultimate goal. We want street environments where people feel this is our space, it's our public space, it belongs to us, and we use it how we wish. And this example here is some women who were taught how to cycle. And healthy streets is not just about physical changes to streets, but it's also about skilling people up to use streets differently. And an important part of that is providing people with the skills to be able to cycle in the street, with things like travel planning, so people can understand the trips that they could walk or they could cycle, and giving them the confidence to travel differently. Oops. And here's our final image for Everyone Feels Welcome. Maybe familiar to those of you who are in Stockholm. And this is one of these temporary street closures. So just for a few hours of the day, the street is closed to cars so that people can go out and use the street differently. And the reason why I like this picture is because children are really our indicator species of whether we're doing things well. And this is a nice picture of showing children feeling free and comfortable and relaxed using the street. And we can ask ourselves, how many of our streets do we see children out looking free and relaxed and comfortable? And the answer is probably not very many, and it shows the scale of the challenge that we have to address. So these are the 10 indicators, and these are not 10 things that you find on a street. They're 10 aspects of the human experience of being on streets. And because you have one brain in one body, it means you experience all these things at once. So they're all interconnected with each other. Okay, Amelia.
All right, so before we move on, we wanted to take a little bit of a look at some of these Mentimeter results for the questions that we asked everybody to fill out beforehand, and which I think will tie into this next section that you're about to present. And so one question that we asked our audience here was, do your city leaders cycle or walk every day in the city they lead? 16% or so answered yes, or maybe it's 16 people. 20 no, and 32 I don't know. So a majority of people don't know, and next in line is people saying no. Is this a result that maybe was expected for you, or does it look familiar?
I think it's a much more positive than I expected, actually. I think it's really shocking how few city leaders really understand the challenge that they're trying to address. They tend to be people who are consider themselves to have very busy lives and to maybe be on quite high incomes, and that can mean that they use modes of travel that aren't that commonly used by the people who live in the city, like taxis and private vehicles. And I think it's really hard to change a city if the city leaders don't fully understand the scale of what they need to do to change that experience of being on the street. They need to experience how unpleasant it currently is to cycle, or how unpleasant it currently is to walk, so that they can see what they need to change.
Great, and I think we'll maybe tie in a little bit more to that theme in the next section. Mm-hmm. And do you know what proportion of car journeys in your city are under 5 kilometers long? We have a majority of people saying yes, they do know. So we seem to have a very informed audience here. 12 saying no, and then almost the same amount of people saying I don't know, as have said yes.
Okay.
Why do you think this question is important? Why is it important for people to know this fact?
Yeah, so this, I think, just like the last question, it's a really important one for you to know for yourself, because as for the last one, if you don't know whether your leaders walk and cycle every day, go and find out, because it's useful for you to know that. It helps you to understand what challenge you have, and maybe you can offer to take them walking and cycling so that they can see it for themselves. This one's really important because if your job is promoting walking or cycling, some of the people who you talk to, in fact, many of the people who you need to convince, they will assume that every car journey that happens in the city has to be done by car. They assume that, of course, people wouldn't be using a car for a journey that could be walked or cycled, because we're all logical people, so we only use cars for journeys that must be done in a car. The reality, of course, is that we use the car because it's convenient for lots of journeys, when it would actually be better for people to be walking and cycling them. So you need to know that you have a huge proportion of short car journeys in your city, so that you can convince those people in positions of power that this is a very inefficient way to be running a city, and that your city would be much better if you can switch at least a certain proportion of those very short car journeys over to walking and cycling. So this is a really key statistic that you need when you're trying to convince people that change is possible and that change is necessary.
So it shows the importance of maybe actually looking at statistics and data and using that to question perhaps some of your own underlying assumptions about the way things are and need to be, or using that as a tool to help others maybe consider some new ideas. All right, let's take a look at this next one that ties in as well. Do your city planning rules make it hard for developers to build buildings that are primarily served by cars? Where we have a big majority in the middle here saying no, they do not. Seems to be a majority thinking that here. What do you think about that result?
So yeah, this is my experience in many places. I'll talk in the next section about how London is addressing this, and I think it's a real leader in this area. But if you have a transport department who are trying to pursue sustainable transport goals, but the planning department is giving permission to lots of new buildings being built that have huge amounts of car parking, that are easy to get to by car, then it undermines what the transport department are trying to do. So you have to have transport and planning working together as a team to achieve this goal of the shift to sustainable travel. And if you need an example of somewhere where it's being done well, then I can talk to you a little bit about the London example, and you can use that when you're trying to convince people of the need for change.
Yeah, I think we're all looking forward to learning more about London as a case, as it's such a big city that seems to be doing a lot of active work right now. And our final Mentimeter question before we then dig into some of these questions more in the last section of your presentation, we've asked everybody to send some thoughts on what the biggest challenge for increasing healthy transportation in their own cities is. And it seems like some of the most common words, we have a lot of different factors appearing here, but we have people, money, infrastructure, attitudes and attitude, so a lot of attitude there, politics, funding, space, but also weather and cars. Are these challenges that people see as big hindrances? Are these familiar to you? And do you think you can maybe tie into some of these?
Yeah, definitely. Healthy Streets is all about reframing this conversation to change the attitudes of a wide range of people. And a common reason people give for not doing things differently is that we don't have extra money for doing it. But the point of Healthy Streets is not having some extra money and doing everything else the same way you've always done it. It's about changing the way you spend every penny that you currently spend to spend it differently. So it's not about getting extra money, it's about spending the money you have differently. And actually in London, when they adopted Healthy Streets, it was at a time when their budget was cut. So we had less money to deliver Healthy Streets than we had before for not delivering Healthy Streets. And actually, delivering a shift away from car use is a lot cheaper than delivering for increased car use. Building new roads is really expensive. Reallocating road space for walking and cycling is not really expensive. In fact, that's been one of the challenges for getting change to happen, is it doesn't cost enough for people to think it's important.
Yeah, so really the need to dig into a shift in perspectives, and it's not just maybe a quick fix, but digging deep into our fundamental viewpoints in the way we build and create our cities. All right, great. Well, let's hear a little bit more about your thoughts on how we can work with the Healthy Streets approach. Let's see your next section.
So I'm going to take you now through some of the things that I think are central to getting healthy streets. And the first one is focusing on people's experience of being on the streets. I've talked a little bit about this already. If people are used to being in a car all the time, they don't really have a lot of direct experience of what it feels like to be on a street. And if you ask them about these 10 Healthy Streets indicators, they start to look differently at the street and they start to connect with their experience of being there. So we need to help lots of people who don't currently see there's a problem. that streets could and should be better. And that means having a lot of conversations with a lot of people and asking them to ask themselves some critical questions. Here's an example of a tool that we use to achieve this in London. It's called the Healthy Street Survey. And what we do is we pick a location on a street and we stand there all day, 7 days a week, and we stop people at random. And we ask them in a short interview to rate each of the Healthy Streets indicators out of 10 for that location at that moment in time. And this is one of the locations where we did this survey twice. So first of all, picture on the left is how the street looked back in 2014. And then the picture on the right is how the street looked in 2017. So there wasn't a huge transformation on this street. It's an outer suburb, it's a fast moving road, but they provided a bi-directional cycle track and they put some new crossing points in. So this was the change that they made. So not a huge benefit to people walking, who are the people who are being asked the survey questions. The questions they were asked were, how clean do you think the air is today, between 1 and 10? How intimidated do you feel by the traffic on this street, between 1 and 10? How safe do you feel from crime and antisocial behaviour, between 1 and 10? And so on. We went through each of the Healthy Streets indicators. And these were the results. So the bars at the top show what people scored the street when we stopped them at random before the changes were made. And then the bars at the underneath, in the darker colours, show the scores that they gave when we went back later on. And you can see across all the indicators, there's an improvement in the score. So people, even though they had no context for the questions that were being asked, experienced the street to be better after the changes had been made. And this kind of survey is really valuable for communicating to political leaders and organisational leaders that the general public support and recognise when they make changes to streets. It's very hard for leaders who hear the negative responses from the minority. And this kind of data is very powerful if you can say, actually, we stopped people at random on the street and they said that the streets are much better. So you are supported in these kinds of changes. Talking to people about how do you rate the street, what do you think could be better, changes the nature of the relationship with stakeholders. At the moment, there's often a certain sense of division, of combat between government is making changes and the people don't like it and they protest it. And the picture on the left is one example of people protesting healthy streets type measures being implemented a few years ago in London. Using the healthy streets approach is much more collaborative. So the picture on the right shows a group of practitioners out in the community stopping people on the street and saying, what do you think of these indicators? What do you think of this space? How do you think things could be better? So it's a much more collaborative relationship instead of a combative relationship. The second one is how do you get healthy streets? Is broaden the conversation beyond transport. So I don't know how many of you on this call consider yourselves to work in the transport sector, but often the changes to streets that are made are led by transport. However, just because they're led by transport doesn't mean that they're only important from a transport perspective. So how our streets look and feel will have massive impacts on the health sector, on policing, on housing, environment, culture, and really all these different departments and sectors should be involved in the process of making the change happen. If it's led from a transport lens, you end up with a transport solution to a transport problem. But what Healthy Streets is about is saying this is a much more complex system that we're dealing with. And it's not just about transport, it's about the places people live and where they spend time and their health and how they feel. And that requires more voices. So the Healthy Streets framework is very simple, as you've seen, and it's very plain language. There's no professional language used in it. And that means it's much easier to bring different sectors together to work on delivering it. And this was the experience in London. Led by the Mayor of London, each of the different sectors embedded healthy streets in their strategy. So every single statutory strategy includes healthy streets. As you'd expect, the transport strategy has healthy streets as a framework. As we've just discussed, the spatial planning policy, called the London Plan, has a key policy around healthy streets, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But also the policing strategy, the health strategy, the environment strategy, and so on. So this one shared framework that's simple for everyone to understand and see the benefits for them means that everyone can work together collaboratively to achieve the goal. And community-led initiatives I wanted to talk about. So this document here, Small Change, Big Impact, includes examples of projects where the community can lead to make changes to their street. So it's a guidance tool for if you're a voluntary group or a community activist who wants to do things differently. And the picture on the right was an initiative by one member of the public who felt frustrated that the space on the street was used only for storing private cars, and she felt that there should be something else. So she bought these plants and these seats and this piece of fake grass and these cycle storage, and she put them out on the street. And it obviously provides a community facility, but it also shows people that streets can be for something other than storing cars. So these kinds of community initiatives are a really important part of delivering healthy streets. And because the framework is easily accessible, I think it gives people confidence that it's obvious to them that they have permission to make these changes. And often people say, well, if you're trying to do things to promote sustainable transport, it's going to be bad for business. So it's really important to get the businesses involved and seeing how they benefit from these kinds of changes. So here we have a cultural event, which is a nighttime show where all the streets are closed and they have light shows on, so people can walk along empty streets, traffic-free streets, to experience the city at night. The central picture is where a back street was transformed into a row of boutique shops and cafes to activate a street in a retail area. And the picture on the right is an area that is normally very quiet. It's in the city centre, it's for businesses, but they wanted visitors to come on the weekend. So they introduced a street festival and put circus attractions in the street for people to come and use the street differently. And it shows that businesses do support these kinds of changes and they benefit from them. Aligning the planning system, I've mentioned this already. So the picture on the right shows you the cover of the London Plan, the spatial plan for London, and it has this policy on healthy streets that puts the responsibility on the developer to demonstrate that they will improve the healthy streets indicators. They must demonstrate how they will reduce the dominance of vehicles and how they will make sure that they are permeable by foot and by cycle and connected to cycle networks and public transport. Really important. So this means that instead of delivering things like the image at the bottom, low density detached housing, developers are pushed towards higher density developments that are easy to serve by public transport and cycle infrastructure, that have got active frontages. These higher density mixed use developments have very low car parking and high cycle parking provision. And this helps provide the basic skeleton for a city that can have healthy streets. And then to go another step further, beyond setting rules for the developers, we can also provide the developers with guidance on how they can do it. So this picture on the left is of one of the reports I've produced for developers that assesses the site that they're about to develop and advises them on what they need to do in that site to make it healthy, to make it compliant with the policy that they need to achieve. I do a healthy streets quantitative assessment on all the streets in their development and show them specifically what things they need to change to get their healthy street score to go up. So 3, how do you get a healthy streets? You need to take a universal and comprehensive approach. So one way of doing this, one part of the story, is this tool that I developed called the Healthy Streets Check for Designers. This is a quantitative assessment tool that is used by our engineers and designers. In London, it's used on every single street change, no matter how small. This simple spreadsheet tool has 31 metrics, and the designer has to assess the existing street. So if you look at the picture on the left there, that was the existing street, and also assess their proposed design, which is the picture on the right. So before anything is built, before any money is spent, before there is any disruption on the street, we know how much healthier the street will be after the changes are made. And that gives us an opportunity to change the design and make sure it's as healthy as it can be before we spend any money. So for this example of this change, which has now been implemented, the tool produces this diagram. So you have the indicators around the outside, and a blue line shows the existing conditions, and a red line shows what the proposed design will deliver. So you can see here the red line is outside the blue line, which means that the street will become healthier, and you can see how much healthier it's going to become and which of the indicators are improving a lot, like people feel safe, and which are not improving much at all, like not too noisy and shade and shelter. And then the designers can go back and see, well, what more could we do to try and get the score to go higher? And this tool is not just used on big, expensive projects like the one I just showed you. This is a very small change in a very outer area on the outskirts of London. And the picture at the top shows the conditions before. There is a crossing point, but it's quite dangerous and not very accessible because there are no traffic lights and the cars are moving very fast. So the change that was made was they introduced a traffic light control crossing, and they made it a crossing for people both walking and cycling to improve cycle connectivity. Not a big change, but still the same tool is used in the same way. So you can see small improvements are made here, and then the designers can decide, is this a good use of money? Do we want to make this small change here? Or would we rather make a bigger change somewhere else? Would we rather have 10 of these crossings that delivered lots of small changes, or would we rather have one big change? They can make those kinds of decisions about how they spend their money. And this tool can also be used on temporary changes as well. So when you're trying to get people on board with a more permanent change, maybe you make a temporary change and show them how it feels. This example here was a car-free day, International Car-Free Day. The picture at the top shows how the street normally looks, and the picture at the bottom shows how it looks on International Car-Free Day. And you can see there's a huge increase in the Healthy Streets score across all the indicators when the traffic is removed from this street. And this data is really easy to show to the public, to have a conversation with them about whether they want that change to be made permanent or not. And here's citywide data collection. So the tool that I've shown you so far, the design tool, is for individual little locations. But Healthy Streets is about population-wide across a whole city region. How are we improving people's health? So we can't just look at little individual locations. We also have to look at, are we delivering a real measurable improvement across the whole region? So this picture here shows you an aerial shot of London. If you know London, then that black snaky line through the middle is the River Thames. And every street in London has been color-coded, green, yellow, or red, by how healthy it is. And then we can track over time whether the colors of this map change or not. So you can see the biggest roads are the reddest roads. The data that goes into this is big citywide data sets on land use, street network connectivity, population density, the widths of the pavements, the levels of traffic, air quality, noise, trees, all the things that we can collect at a city level to track changes over time. And finally, in how do you get healthy streets? My fourth area is leadership and governance. So, my experience generally when it comes to spending money on streets and transport is that the money is divided up into little pots, and different teams have different pots of money that they spend on delivering their priority. And this is not always delivering the best outcomes. The purpose of Healthy Streets is to get people to work together and to balance the pros and cons of different options and weigh things up and make the best decision in the round for improving public health. When people have their own separate pots of money, it doesn't encourage them to work together. So what they did in London was they created one pot of money called the Healthy Streets Fund. And every single team, if they wanted some money, they had to apply to the Healthy Streets Fund, and they had to show how the money that they would spend would not only benefit their priority, but it would also benefit all of the Healthy Streets indicators. So how were they thinking about their work through that Healthy Streets perspective? And this change in how the money was distributed impacted then on how people worked, on how they collaborated, and how they all pushed towards achieving one shared goal. Another useful part of the process was using the World Health Organization's HEAT tool, Health Economic Assessment Tool for Walking and Cycling. And this was because one of the first barriers to trying to make change happen is people say, well, the business case doesn't add up if we're not making it easy for the cars to flow. So to help to counter that argument, we have to show the monetized health benefits of projects that increase walking and cycling so that they can include that in the business case and see that on balance, there is a net benefit. One of the first steps I had was taking what I knew about the World Health Organization's HEAT tool and writing a London manual, which is the document at the top left, valuing the health benefits of transport schemes. And that was because for my resistant local audience, if I gave them a World Health Organization document, they would dismiss it. But if I give them a document with their own company branding on it and photographs of their own city and talk to them in their own language, then they take ownership of it. So I wasn't really telling them anything that wasn't already published, but I was just packaging it in a way that made it acceptable to them and accessible to them. So the manual is the document at the top, and the document at the bottom, called Better Streets Delivered To, was a portfolio of examples of projects that we had delivered. I monetized the health benefits so that I could show people, actually, you know, we do already deliver these health benefits. Feel good about yourselves. This is a benefit of what you do. And one of the examples is this one in the middle of the slide here. So the picture on the left shows how the street looked before. The picture on the right shows how the street looked after. And I calculated the monetized health benefits for both walking and cycling, and those are presented underneath. And political leadership, we've spoken a little about this already. So you won't know who these people are. The one on the left is the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. He used to be the Mayor of London, and he cycles every day. He's a strong advocate for cycling, and I know that he really understands what it feels like to cycle in London because he has a lot of everyday experience of doing it. And he has really pushed for improvements both at a London level and at a national level to improve conditions for people cycling. The middle picture is the current Mayor of London, out experiencing what it's like to cycle. And the picture on the right is the Deputy Mayor for Transport for London. And she's on some of the new cycle infrastructure that was put in response to COVID, where they've implemented some new temporary cycle infrastructure. And that is the end.
All right. Thank you so much, Lucy, for your presentation. Well, we have a few questions coming in from the audience here. And we have one that I think ties in quite well to this last part of your presentation, that's maybe digging a little bit more into this question of how can you convince politicians who don't have active mobility or healthy streets at the top of their agenda to prioritize that more so. You gave a little bit of a tip here about packaging information in a way that is attractive to city leaders. What other tools or activities do you think we can do to convince our political leaders to prioritize this?
I think that from my own experience, I spent far too much time writing documents with references to evidence And while those things are needed, the things that I found really made a difference was when people experienced things for themselves, and when they heard personal stories from people who elected them. So if you have leaders in your organization, find some way of taking them out onto the streets and asking them how they think the streets are performing, and then get them to hear from other people who really struggle. So certain people find streets much harder to use than the fit, able-bodied 45-year-old man who's most likely the leader of the transport organisation. So talk to women, people who are disabled, people who are sick, people who are older, people who have mobility impairments, and share their voices with those leaders. And that will really probably be much more influential than a really well-written policy document.
So some great advice. And I think tying into that, amplifying and lifting the voices of different types of traffic users who maybe aren't the most often heard. You talked a little bit about community-led, community-driven initiatives. What are some other ways that cities can support community-led initiatives or to have participatory processes in planning for healthier streets?
Yeah, so the tool that I mentioned was really trying to give some tips on here's how you cut through all the red tape and the bureaucracy to make some of these changes happen. But there's other things that can be done. So providing small grants to people to try new things, so small amounts of money to seed fund new ideas, and promoting those on social media and making sure that they get a lot of visibility. Other ways that people in positions of power can help to nurture these new ideas from the community as well.
Great, thanks. And we have a question here from many of us are in cold climate cities and countries. And maybe London, your home base, isn't quite as cold. But what are some ways that we can work to make public transport or active mobility more convenient or more attractive even during the winter months?
So climate is often presented to me as a barrier, either from people who say their climate's too hot or they say their climate's too cold. And as I'm sure you know, I think Finland has got some of the highest levels of cycling in some of the coldest, snowiest parts of the country. And that's often cited as the example that climate is not the barrier, it's what facilities are you providing for people. And there are different challenges in different countries. So the other challenge that we all have is that our climates are changing quite rapidly. So if you have very cold winters at the moment, in 10 years, they're probably not going to be as cold as they are now. But how are you going to be dealing with flash floods, with hotter summers? When I talk to people in Australia, they're very cognizant of the importance of providing shade in streets. In Europe, it's a much bigger challenge towards the northern countries to get people to recognise that we're going to need more shade in the coming years. So talking about how our climate will change and how we need to start making those changes to prepare for it now can be quite helpful. But I wouldn't think I'm the expert on how you get people cycling in winter in cold climates. I would definitely ask some of the people on this call who know a lot more about it than me.
Absolutely. Maybe some people who are listening in can share some of their tips in the chat. We'll have some knowledge sharing then. But I think that's a really interesting point to even be using the climate itself as an argument for the need for more active transportation. We also had a question that was tying into, I think, some of these questions regarding funding, and that there's kind of a disconnect between the impact of these health impacts of transport planning and urban planning that shows up more long-term in the health sector. How do you think, we heard a little bit about the heat tool, but are there any other ways that you can more clearly show that correlation between budgets for urban planning and transport planning and the health sector?
I think that the heat tool is the best available tool at the moment. And often there's an assumption that the health impacts of inactivity are very long term. So if someone's inactive now, we'll have to wait 40 years for them to have a heart attack to prove that that was the connection. But actually, a lot of the health impacts of physical activity or physical inactivity are very short term. So stress, anxiety, poor sleep, depression, these are all things that can be turned around very quickly through physical activity every day. And they're also the things that people are most frequently going to see their general practitioner about. So engagement with frontline doctors to be promoting physical activity as a treatment and management system for regular chronic complaints is a really important part that generally isn't really capitalized on as much as it should be.
And we have a question that ties into that a little bit, and I think you touched on it with your discussion on the way your tool to quantify the impact of different changes in the cities. But we have a question here about noise being a stress factor and traffic behavior, different stress factors in the built environment. But how can you exactly measure how stressful traffic can be?
Mm-hmm. So what we do for measuring healthy streets is we don't try to make that translation through to how stressful are people feeling right now. We know the thresholds for it being too noisy, and we score that. So we know how noisy the streets will be. And if we don't know noise directly, we know the traffic flow, and that helps us to know how noisy it will be. So we use these proxies for understanding those things. And packaging everything in terms of healthy streets means that you're no longer pinned down to give people data that you can't provide them with. In the earliest days, I had lots of people saying to me, if we do this thing on the street, how many heart attacks will I prevent? And I say, I can't tell you how many heart attacks you'll prevent. And then they would look disappointed and disinterested, and they'd walk away. But packaging it in terms of your street is currently scoring 50 in terms of how healthy it is, and if you make this change, it will score 70. That's a good middle ground between what they want and what we can realistically achieve.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we're running out of time a little bit, and there's a few questions we haven't gotten around to, and I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe Lucy, you can take a look in the chat and see if there's any that you can answer as we wrap up. Yeah. Before we finish here, and if anybody has to leave exactly at 1:30, we understand that we'll be recording these last few minutes, so you can catch up later if you need to. We would just like to thank you again, Lucy, for sharing your presentation with us and your work with Healthy Streets. And thank you also to everyone for joining us today. And before we end, we'd like to share a few things from the HEAT project team. We'll be having our next and final webinar in the project next month on December 10th. And it's on diverse perspectives in cycle planning, with a specific focus on how to better include the perspectives of children, seniors, and modified bike users, such as arm bikes or tricycles, in cycle planning. So some of these groups that you were talking about earlier, Lucy. You can find the program for that and register on our webpage, heatproject.eu, and we'll of course include a link to that as well in the information we send out afterwards with the recording of the webinar. And if you want to join up with other professionals or activists in the field of participatory urban planning, we have started a LinkedIn group for that called just Participatory Urban Planning on LinkedIn. So we'll include a link to that as well in the information we send out. And finally, we're very happy to share from the HEAT project team that we've been working on a digital handbook for participatory urban planning with some of our experiences and our work in the project from the past few years. That's been published on our website today. And there will also be some more materials, videos, infographic posters coming later in November. You can find that at heatproject.eu/results. And in it, we share some of our experiences on using the HEAT tool in our different cities in the project, coordinating campaigns and advocating for cycling, and working with different digital tools for participation. So we hope you'll check that out. And we will sign off here by showing a video soon that is from this digital handbook that's on some tips and tricks and questions to ask yourself when you're planning a campaign. And finally, again, before we play the video and say goodbye for today, we want to thank Lucy. We look forward to following your work in the future. And thank you again to everyone for joining us. We hope we'll see you again on December 10th for our last webinar on diverse perspectives in cycle planning.